This is the radio, the European radio show, streaming live for 3 days from the Grande Halle de la Villette in Paris.
I did mention that classical music would also be a feature on today's particular show, because it's a stream of content that some would say is niche. And the whole point of this particular hour is to unmask the various elements of radio. And I'm joined now by a young man who is a composer, Jack Pepper, who spoke yesterday about classical music and changing its perception. And how are you trying to do that, Jack?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. Excited to be here. Scala Radio this week has announced its existence. It's come into the world to change the perception of classical music. And interestingly, following on from Michael's conversation, it's a DAB station. So we're very, very keen to be changing the way that classical music is perceived. It's classical music for the modern world. And as you say, yesterday I was speaking about the different ways that we can change the perception of classical music, because I personally, as a composer, have seen behind the scenes. I've gone through stage doors and through corridors and seen people who I don't think are being portrayed at the moment necessarily in much classical music broadcasting. And it's those faces, that diversity, that variety, that I think makes this world so exciting. So yes, it's a niche, but I do think that it's not represented, both in terms of the content, but also another important point, the number of stations. I mean, in the UK, we've got over 300 national pop stations, and yet only currently 2, becoming 3 national classical networks. So yes, classical music is arguably a minority taste, but I actually think that there are a huge number of people out there who can be reached, who perhaps aren't necessarily at the moment, because we're not capturing that variety that makes classical music so exciting and relevant to the modern day. Well,
interesting point that you bring in the modern day, because the 2 guests that I had previously were talking about the integration of various mediums, with radio being the core foundation, yes, but we're living in a time now where there's integrated content, and you take a piece of audio and you turn it into a visual medium, etc., etc. So if you're trying to get a different sort of stance on what classical music is about, how are you reaching out to change this perception beyond just terrestrial radio? Because I think the message needs to be loud on multiple platforms.
Well, at Bauer Media, we're having lots of conversations with lots of different groups, ensembles, so we're very, very keen to have a dialogue with the wider classical music world, because, as I say, this world is very, very broad, and we want to be able to reflect everybody who's in it. But if you look at the presenter lineup of the station, we've got people like Goldie, the drum and bass star. He'll be talking about his route into classical music, but then I'll be presenting the perspective of a younger musician in that world, sort of earlier in my career. So we're very, very keen in terms of the faces that are presenting classical music to represent that huge breadth of the different perspectives of pop musicians coming to classical music, as well as young musicians as well. So it's capturing that variety of people, I think, as well as different mediums of presenting it.
And in terms of then looking at different genres that sort of take from classical music, your thoughts on that, being that you are a composer?
Well, I mean, I write music theatre, I write pop songs as well as classical pieces. So for me, variety is music's greatest strength. And I said this in my session at the conference yesterday afternoon, that music is one glorious whole, and then all the different genres are all interrelated. They're feeding into one another, they're reflecting each other. And I think it's really important that actually, whilst radio can categorise these different genres, we see music as this wonderful, glorious whole, as I say, where there are lots of different genres, but they're all interrelated. And, you know, I suppose I'm an example of somebody who's writing in that way as well. I think it's the way we listen. We don't just pigeonhole a certain genre, but we enjoy the variety, and jumping from listening to a pop song to a classical piece. That's how I listen, and that's how I compose as well. You know, one morning I'm writing a classical piece for orchestra, and then in the afternoon I'm writing a music theatre piece. And I don't think twice about that variety. For me, it enriches the music.
And how are you then going to translate this onto tangible and accessible content on your radio platform?
Well, we'll be talking about old familiar masters like Mozart, like Holst, but we'll also be very willing to talk about film scores, about, as I say, Goldie in drum and bass, how he's come into classical music from a different era of the music world. So it's being able to see lots of different perspectives and different routes into the same world, because there's, I think the stereotype about classical music is very much old white man dead in a wig, really, but the stereotype is not true. I've been very lucky, as I say, going behind the scenes as a composer to realise that there are far broader ages, backgrounds, working within classical music, and that it's still very much alive and powerful today. And I think it's important that we reflect that in the content, in presenter lineups, and in the music that we play as well.
And then in terms of your own other platforms, I go back to this point that radio is no longer a segregated medium. Yes, it's there to lay a foundation. But over and above that, apps, social media integration to ensure that there's life beyond just the time that you're on radio for. How is Bauer Media, particularly with this new classical radio station, hoping to continue the conversation beyond on air?
Well, it's precisely that, as you say. It's a conversation, it's two-way, it's interaction. And therefore, when listeners are contacting us on Instagram already, the station launches in March, but we're already starting the conversation with listeners and with other musicians as well. So it's very important for us to be able to actually have a two-way conversation. It's not like a big station that you will not be able to actually engage with. So already, personally, I've been speaking with listeners and with other musicians that I know, asking them what's the music that they want to hear, what is the music that excites them, and what do they want to learn and discover, because we're very, very keen to be playing things that people are familiar with, but also to be throwing in unexpected surprises and really cultivating that joy of discovery and exploring, which classical music is so rich for.
And what are you thinking would be a clean-cut strategy in order to engage and keep the listener hooked?
Well, in my talk yesterday, we were speaking about the balance between sort of engaging in music in different levels. So talking anecdotally about stories from the lives of composers, portraying them as human beings rather than the sort of painting of a man in a wig, as I said earlier.
Give me an example of how you execute that.
So I gave an example yesterday in my talk of Beethoven. You might think of the famous picture of a man with wild grey hair and the red cravat. It's something that potentially is quite distant and not really relatable. And yet, if I told you that same man potentially suffered from dyslexia at school, that he left school at the age of 11, that he was abused by an alcoholic father, he'd be locked away in his room. If I told you that when he was older, he fought over the custody of his nephew after his brother died, or that he used music as an outlet for his emotions, suffering from physical disabilities, deafness, all of those things are far more relatable about composers than a catalogue number or a painting of a man in a wig, because classical music is relatable. It's about and by and for human beings, and we all share those ups and downs, those disappointments, those heartbreaks, those physical ailments that actually classical music is responding to as much as a pop song might be or a piece of jazz. So it's very important, I think, to couch this music in human terms. So like the last year I've been working with Resonance FM, which is a small community radio station in London, and I've been presenting a 42-episode marathon anecdotal history of classical music, which is talking about stories, so weird and wonderful tales from the lives of classical composers. And the whole idea is to show that the composers are human beings, that they're sharing the same experiences that we do now. So rather than seeing classical music as this distant bubble that is always sort of somebody piously sitting in a church writing for God, actually so often this music is written about human experiences that, whether it's 1700s or the 20th century or indeed today when classical music is still being written, it's all related to the human experience, which is something we can all tap into.
Absolutely, something that we can definitely all tap into, listen to and engage with. on various streams, as I mentioned, not just on air, but definitely on social media, to also just enhance the conversation and to keep that momentum going and growing the ever-changing world of radio. And that's exactly what we're doing here on Connect on Air with Radio Unmasked. Had the pleasure of speaking to Michael Hill from Radio Player as well.
The European Radio Show.